5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
Hello everyone, welcome to Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host Polar Bear, and on tonight's episode we're going to get into Dogman versus Werewolf and which one is more dangerous. And why do we get into that? Well, because I made a short and I posted on YouTube and somebody left a comment asking the question. So I decided to jump down the rabbit hole, and I did a lot of research and came up with this. But before we get started, I want you to picture this. Picture us in the woods around a campfire, right? And somebody just asked a question. And as we're putting logs on this fire, I'll let you be the judge on which one's more dangerous. So with that being said, let's dive right in. You ever notice how conversations change once it gets late enough? Not the polite kind of late. I'm talking about that hour where the fire's burned down to coals. Somebody's drink is warmer than it should be, and the woods around you stop being background noise and start feeling like a presence. That's usually when someone finally says it. All right, so what's the difference really? Dogman, werewolf? People say the words like they're interchangeable, like it's just two names for the same shadow, same thing, different folklore, and most of the time, nobody pushes back on that. It's easier not to. Easier to lump them together and move on. But here's the thing, the people who've actually seen something don't talk like that. They don't argue semantics. They don't debate mythology. They don't say, well, technically. They say, no, it wasn't like that. They say, I thought about it for years and I know what it wasn't. Once you start listening closely, a pattern forms. Not a clean one, not a comfortable one, but a real one, right? Because Dogman and Werewolf don't just look different, they arrive differently. They behave differently. And most importantly, they leave people with different kinds of fear. So let's start with one that's been showing up more and more recently as time goes on. This one is the one that people run into without realizing what they're dealing with until it's already too late to pretend it's a normal animal, being Dogman. Most Dogman encounters don't begin with terror. That's important. They begin with confusion. A wrongness that doesn't have a name yet. Someone driving a back road or standing near a tree line or sitting in a deer blind or a job site or behind their house taking out the trash, and they see movement where movement makes sense until it doesn't. At first, it's just big, bigger than it should be. Then it stands up, not rearing, not lunging, standing, like that was always an option. That moment, that's where Dogman lives. Because Dogman doesn't announce itself with myth. It doesn't feel supernatural right away. It feels biological, like you just discovered an animal you were never meant to see upright. And I personally believe they are flesh and blood, not mythical. People always say the same thing about the posture. The shoulders don't slump like a bear, legs don't buckle like a startled animal. It straightens and suddenly the rules change. And here's where I need to slow this down for a second. Dogman witnesses almost never describe chaos in those first few seconds. No screaming, no scrambling. There's a pause, a quiet recalibration where the brain tries to catch up because your instincts are firing, but they are arguing with each other. Predator, but not hunting. Animal, but watching. And the eyes. People hesitate when they talk about the eyes, not because they glow or flash or do anything cinematic. It's worse than that. They focus. Not wide, not feral. Focus in a way that feels assessing. Like it's measuring distance, reaction, intent. Like it's deciding something, not reacting. That's a Dogman tell. Dogman doesn't rush. In a lot of encounters, it lets itself be seen, steps into moonlight, shifts weight, turn its head slowly, deliberately, almost casually. And the witnesses, whether grown men, hunters, truck drivers, people who know animals, freeze because nothing in their experience prepares them for an animal that doesn't behave like prey or panic like a cornered predator. And then there's the smell. This comes up more than people realize. Not every time, but often enough that it matters. A wet, sour, musky stink, like damp fur and rot, and something sharp underneath it. Not death exactly, more like territory. Like you've crossed into a space you weren't invited into. Here's where the explanation lives. Not as a lecture, but as a realization. Dogman encounters tend to stay grounded in place. Roads, forest edges, rural towns, old industrial sites, places where people and wilderness overlap. And when the encounter ends, it doesn't usually end with transformation or disappearance. It ends with withdrawal. The dogman will back away, steps off the road, melts into a tree-lined shadow, turns and walks, not runs, back into cover. And that's often worse than a chase would be because it suggests control, like it was never unsure how this was going to go. Now, listen here. That feeling in your chest, that controlled, measured fear, the kind that makes you replay the moment later and realize how exposed you really were. Because werewolf fear, that doesn't feel like that at all, okay? Where dogman feels present, werewolf feels impending. And people don't usually see a werewolf first. They sense it. Something building. Something wrong with the night itself. The air gets heavy. Sounds fall out of rhythm. Dogs won't settle. Livestock act strange. People describe a pressure. Not physical, but psychological. Like the environment itself is leaning inward. Werewolf encounters carry anticipation. Dread that creeps before the shape ever shows itself. And when it does show up, the descriptions change tone immediately. This isn't an animal that stood up. No, it's far worse. This is something that shouldn't be here. Witnesses struggle more with language when describing werewolves, not because they're exaggerating, no, but because the details don't sit cleanly in the brain. Proportions feel off, movement feels wrong, too fluid in one second, too rigid in the next. Limbs bend in the way they shouldn't, or move with a purpose that feels directed. And there's often a sense, quiet, disturbing, that whatever this thing is, it knows you're not supposed to be seeing it. Werewolf encounters escalate quickly. They carry vitality, growls come sooner, the atmosphere snaps instead of stretches. And unlike Dogman, which often watches from a distance, werewolf stories include intrusion, approach, pursuit, and confirmation. Even when no physical attack happens, witnesses come away shaken in a different way. Less analytical, more unsettled, like they brushed up against something that had intention beyond survival. And here's the part most people miss, and that part matters if you're sitting around a fire trying to understand what these things actually are. Dogman fear is external, and werewolf fear is internal. With that being said, because a dogman makes you feel hunted in the woods, werewolf makes you feel like the rules of the woods changed, or the world, without warning. And once you start separating encounters this way by behavior, by atmosphere, by how people describe what lingered afterward, you stop asking whether they are the same thing. You start asking a much worse question. What if they never were? And if that's true, then what else have we been mislabeling just to feel safer? And that's where this gets a smidge uncomfortable. Because now the fire's quieter and the woods feel closer than they did when we started. So now we're going to go into detail about some dogman. Because there's a moment in a lot of dogman encounters that doesn't get talked about much, mostly because it doesn't fit neatly into how we expect fear to behave. It's the moment when nothing happens. Not right away. The witnesses realize they're not alone. They see the shape, they understand slowly that what they're looking at is upright, tall, furred, and wrong. And instead of charging, instead of bolting, instead of growling or bluffing, it just stays there, watching you. Which is more intense than any other situation you could be in, I feel like. Having a 10-foot monster staring at you. And that stillness is what separates dogman encounters from ordinary wildlife sightings. Because animals don't linger once they've been spotted. Predators don't expose themselves unless there's a reason, and prey doesn't stand its ground without panic. Dogman does neither, okay? One encounter that sticks with me, actually there's several that really do, but one that I can truly remember hearing about happened out on a stretch of rural road that locals use so often they don't even think of it as isolated anymore. Trees on both sides, no shoulder to speak of, just pavement cutting through dark woods like a thin promise of safety. A man was driving home late. Nothing dramatic, no storm, no fog, just one of those nights where the world feels hollow. He noticed movement ahead and slowed, expecting a deer. That's how these stories always start, because deer, it makes sense, right? Deer, bears, bobcats, cougars. That all makes sense in the woods. But then, right, what stepped out in the road did not. It wasn't fast. It didn't dart or spook. It walked out of the tree line on two legs like crossing the road was an afterthought. The height registered first, taller than the hood of the truck, shoulders broad enough to block the beam of the headlight in a way that made the light feel smaller than it should have. And then it turned its head. Not startled, not aggressive, just enough to look directly at him. And he describes the face as unmistakably canine, but not exaggerated. No snarling lips, no glowing eyes, just a long muzzle, heavy brow, and eyes that reflected in the light briefly before settling into something deeper and darker. The truck idled. The man's foot hovered over the brake, and for a few seconds that stretched far too long, nothing happened. Here's the detail that matters. The dogman didn't flinch when the engine revved slightly, didn't react when the headlight shifted. It stood there, weight evenly distributed, arms hanging loose at its sides, posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced, like it had done this before. And then it stepped backwards, not away in fear, but back into the tree line, one slow step at a time, never breaking eye contact. When the last of it disappeared into the shadow, the man realized his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't grip the wheel properly. But, needless to say, he drove the rest of the way home in silence. No radio, no calls, just replaying the way it watched him, like he was a thing out of place. And that's a common thread. And another story that I remember vividly, I don't remember what show I heard this on, but I've told this story on several shows, and this story just stuck with me. It's another one that just really sticks with me. A man and his son were hunting, and out of nowhere, this animal came barreling out of the woods into their right-of-way. The son shoots at it, thinking it's a deer. The dad looks at it and realizes that it's not a deer. The animal stands up on two legs and walks off. They haul ass and get out of the area and get into their truck and go home. 30 miles that dogman tracked them. The kid woke up screaming. The dad went to his room to see what was going on. The son said, "There's a monster outside my window." And when the dad opened the blinds to the back door, there was that dogman that they had shot at. These things are intelligent predators, and they are killers. They are not pets. Dogman doesn't behave like it's surprised by humans. It behaves like it's aware of us, familiar with us, sometimes even tolerant of us, as long as certain boundaries are not crossed. Another encounter happened at a job site. Late hours, industrial equipment shut down for the night. The kind of place that feels safe because it's loud and busy during the day. One man stepped away from the lit area to relieve himself near the tree line, figuring the worst he'd run into was a raccoon, stray dog, coyote. Normal wood stuff, right? What he heard first was breathing. Not panting, not growling, breathing that sounded heavy, controlled, and deliberate. The kind of breathing you notice because it doesn't match your own. When he turned, the dogman was already there. Imagine that. You're going to the restroom. You turn because you hear breathing, and the dogman is standing there, staring at you, and probably towering over you. They're not small animals. This is closer than most encounters. Too close to pretend distance would save him. It was partially in shadow, but close enough that details didn't blur. He could see the fur pattern on its chest, the way the arms bent slightly at the elbows, the hands, not paws, but hands, ending in the dark, blunt claws that rested loosely at its side. And again, the eyes, focused and evaluating. He froze, not out of courage, not out of choice, but because every instinct he had told him sudden movement would be a mistake. The dogman tilted its head just a fraction, as if reassuring him, not angry, not curious, just measuring to see if he was a threat or not. And then after a moment that felt unreal, it turned away. Not fast, not slow, just left. Walked back into the trees with the same confidence it arrived with, that it is the king of the forest. The man didn't run, he didn't shout. He stood there long after it was gone, listening to the woods resume their normal sounds, trying to convince himself that if something truly dangerous had been there, it would have attacked him. But that thought didn't comfort him, because deep down, he knew something worse. It chose not to. Dogman encounters often end this way, not with violence, but with restraint. And that restraint is unsettling because it suggests intent, awareness, a decision-making process that goes beyond instinct. And honestly, because the ones that do it in violence, those people are no longer with us, unfortunately. So, People report feeling like they were being tested or tolerated or warned, and sometimes that warning comes later. There are cases where witnesses report seeing the same dogman again weeks or months later in the same area, same stretch of road, same tree line, same posture. And the dogman is less a wandering creature and more of a fixture, a presence. Like that's its territory, which it possibly could be. I believe these creatures are flesh and blood. And this is where explanations usually get uncomfortable, so let's keep it grounded here, folks. Dogman doesn't feel territorial in the way animals do. It doesn't mark or chase consistently. Instead, it observes, intercepts, shows itself briefly, and then withdraws from the situation. Almost like it's enforcing a rule set we don't understand. And here's something witnesses almost never realize until later. The fear doesn't peak during the encounter, it peaks afterwards. When they're safe, when the adrenaline fades, when the mind finally accepts what the eyes saw. That's when the questions start. Why didn't it attack? Why didn't it run? Why did it stand there? Why did it feel like it knew I was there before I knew it was? Dogman doesn't haunt dreams the way werewolves do. It doesn't feel mythical or cursed or tied to transformation. It feels local, present, flesh and blood, like a real animal. Like something that lives alongside us quietly, stepping forward only when paths cross in the wrong way. And if that's true, if Dogman is a watcher rather than a hunter, then the scariest part isn't what it did, it's what it didn't need to do. So, what happens when it doesn't step back? What happens to you? Think about that, because this is where the other kind of encounters begin. So now we're going to jump into werewolves. My absolute favorite creature out there. I like Dogman a lot. I like Bigfoot a lot, but werewolves are number one for me. There's a difference you start to feel before you see anything. With Dogman, the woods feel occupied. Like something stepped out from behind the curtain and left you notice it for a second. With werewolf encounters, people don't describe that. No, they describe the night changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that something feels off. Like the rhythm of the place slips half a beat out of time. Crickets go quiet. The wind drops. Dogs that normally bark at everything won't make a sound, or they won't stop whining. People say it feels like pressure, like the air thickens around their head and chest, and suddenly they're aware of how alone they are. Werewolf encounters rarely begin with sight. They begin with dread. One account that keeps resurfacing happened near a rural property where the land rolls just enough that you lose sight of the tree line when you step into the yard. The witness had lived there for years, knew every sound, every creak of the fence, every call the animals made at night. That night, the silence came first. Not sudden, but creeping, like someone slowly turning down the volume knob. He stepped outside to check on his livestock and immediately felt it. An instinctive pull in his gut telling him something was wrong. Not danger yet, wrongness, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then he heard the movement. Not crashing, not stalking, something in between. Heavy steps that didn't follow a straight line, circling instead of approaching. He couldn't place the cadence. Too deliberate to be a deer, too fluid to be a bear. And then he saw it. Not fully at first. Just a shape moving between trees, taller than it should be, posture wrong in a way that made his eyes struggle to lock onto it. When it stepped into clear view, the details didn't line up cleanly. Long limbs, fur that didn't sit right against the body, a head that looked wolf-like but carried itself too high, too aware. This wasn't something standing up. This was something standing wrong. And he said the worst part wasn't how it looked. It was how it moved. 1 second slow and controlled, the next covering distance in a way that didn't feel natural, like it could decide how fast the rules applied to it. That's a common thread in werewolf encounters. It unnerves people because it doesn't stay consistent. It accelerates without warning, stops without effort, turns too smoothly. It feels less like muscle and bone and more like intent dragging a body along behind it. The witnesses backed away slowly, never turning his back, every instinct screaming that running would trigger something irreversible. And when the creature finally let out a sound, it wasn't a growl the way people expect. It was lower, throaty, almost frustrated, not territorial, but personal. That right there is another difference people have a hard time trying to articulate. Not only the movement, but that Dogman feels aware of space, where a werewolf feels aware of you, like it's hunting you. In another encounter, a woman driving a back road late at night felt compelled to slow down long before she knew why. The headlights caught movement ahead, not crossing the road, not retreating, but approaching. At first, she thought it was a man. That realization, that moment where the brain reaches for the closest safe explanation, is almost universal. Tall, upright, 2 arms, 2 legs. Then the proportions start to betray the lie. The arms hung too long, the shoulders rolled forward in a way that felt aggressive even at a distance, and when it lifted its head, the shape of its face snapped the illusion apart. This wasn't a person, but it also wasn't an animal in a way she understood. It didn't hesitate when the headlights hit it. Didn't shield its eyes, didn't shy away from the noise of the engine. It stepped closer instead, pace quickening just enough to feel intentional, predatory. She locked the doors without remember doing it. Her foot slammed the accelerator harder than she meant to, and as the car surged forward, the thing lunged, not to grab the vehicle, but to close the distance. And as she sped away, heart pounding so hard she thought she might black out, and in the rearview mirror she caught one last glimpse of it standing in the road, chest heaving, head tilted back slightly, as if memorizing the sound of her engine. That detail shows up more than people like to admit. Werewolves linger in memory not because they retreat, but because they mark the moment. Witnesses feel like they were seen in a way that goes beyond observation, recognized and filed away. And then there's the aftermath. Dogman witnesses talk about fear, confusion, disbelief. Werewolf witnesses talk about disruption. Sleep problems, nightmares, a sense of being watched weeks later in places that should feel safe, an aversion to mirrors in the dark, a lingering sense that something followed them home, not physically, but psychologically. Almost like the encounter didn't end cleanly. Some people report hearing things afterwards. Scratches on siding, pacing footsteps just outside the range of light. Whether those events are connected or the mind trying to process the trauma, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the consistency of the effect. Werewolf encounters do not feel contained. They bleed. And here's where the campfire gets quiet, because this is a part nobody likes to say out loud. Dogman, like I said, feels like flesh and blood. Werewolves, oh, werewolves, they feel like a condition. Something that moves through places and people and moments without staying neatly in one shape or one location. Something tied to escalation, intrusion, and confrontation, bars. Something that doesn't just exist in the wood, but pushes outward. That's why folklore wrapped in its curses and cycles and moonlight and all that stuff, not because people were poetic, but because they were trying to describe a force that didn't behave like an animal. And as you're sitting here tonight, just listening, right, makes you wonder that the realization changes the question entirely. This isn't about which is more dangerous. It's about how they are dangerous. One watches, one advances, one withdraws, one escalates. Once you've heard enough people describe that pressure, that wrongness, that moment when the night turns personal, you stop lumping them together because only one of them feels like it wants something from you. And we need to talk about what happens when that want isn't denied. This is where it gets real. If you're sitting close to the fire listening to old polar bear talk, you probably realize something uncomfortable. This isn't a debate about which one is scarier. It's about how danger works when you're dealing with something that doesn't follow the same rules you do. Because dogmen and werewolves don't threaten people in the same way. They don't even notice people in the same way. And misunderstanding that difference is where most people get hurt or come closer than they'd ever admit out loud. Let's jump back to Dogman for a second. The Dogman danger is quiet, right? Reserved, almost like a procedure. People who encounter Dogman and walk away tend to say the same thing later. I didn't realize how bad it could have been until it was over. That's because Dogman danger isn't explosive unless you're in the LBL. It doesn't spike your adrenaline the way a charging animal does. It seeps in afterwards, when you replay every detail and realize how much control it had over you. Dogman warning signs are subtle, and that's what makes them dangerous. The silence doesn't crash in, it narrows. The smell doesn't overwhelm, it drifts. The posture doesn't threaten, it asserts, right? Dogman doesn't bluff when it shows itself. That is the warning. Stay away. And here's the part most people miss. Dogman encounters rarely escalate unless the human does something to change the equation. Sudden movement, aggressive noise, chasing with headlights, or drawing a weapon. And when you do that, you do not come back. There are accounts, quietly shared, reluctantly told, when someone tried to assert dominance, yelled, revved an engine, fired a warning shot, and that's when the encounter shifted. Dogman doesn't react emotionally. No. It reacts decisively. People describe impossible bursts of speed, distance erased in seconds, a sense that the thing wasn't panicking, it was correcting a problem. In some cases, The dogman closes the gap just enough to prove it can, then stops. In others, it slams a vehicle, dents metals, snaps branches like kindling, maybe to kill, maybe not. Maybe it's just to demonstrate. That dogman danger in its purest form, it doesn't need to finish the job to leave a mark. It needs you to understand something. You failed to understand earlier. You were allowed to leave, and now you know it. The consequences of dogman encounters often come later, not physically, but mentally. People stop using certain roads, quit hunting, refuse night shifts, change jobs, move houses, not because they think dogman is stalking them, no, but because they know they crossed into something that doesn't forget its territory. Dogman teaches fear through restraint. We got into dogman. Let's jump back into werewolf, because the werewolf danger is something else entirely. When dogman operates on control, werewolves operate on escalation. They want to attack you. A werewolf's warning signs don't feel instructional. They feel like a pressure building in a sealed room. You don't get the sense you're being allowed at anything. You get the sense that something is moving toward a release. The signs come faster. Animal panic instead of freezing. The air feels heavy instead of empty. Your thoughts scatter instead of sharpen. And when a werewolf commits to an encounter, it doesn't hover at the edge of it. It enters it. It's coming full force. Werewolf danger is unpredictable, not because it's chaotic, but because it doesn't follow containment. People who survive close encounters often say the same chilling thing. It felt like it wanted a reaction. Fear, flight, resistance, something to push against. Werewolf encounters escalate when attention is given, eye contact, screaming, running, standing your ground, even prayer, in some accounts seems to provoke stronger response rather than calm. So, that's where folklore got it wrong and also accidentally right. It wasn't about silver bullets and moonlight weakness. That's all Hollywood. It was about people trying to define rules for something that didn't behave like an animal and didn't respect human authority. Werewolves don't demonstrate power. They apply it. There are accounts where the only reason someone even survived was because terrain interference. Imagine that. You're running from a werewolf, okay? Full sprint. And guess what stops it? A fence, a vehicle, a narrow doorway, a stumble that delayed pursuit long enough to escape. And when a werewolf encounter ends, it rarely ends cleanly. Dogman leaves people feeling shaken or dead. And werewolves leaves people feeling changed or dead. The injuries that don't heal right, dreams that don't stop, a persistent sense of being watched even indoors, a feeling that something inside them shifted during the encounter. Not possession, not infection, just disturbance. So if you got bit by one or scratched by one, more than likely you're going to turn into one once the moon gets full. But like the encounter reached deeper than skin and nerves. That's the real danger difference. Dogman threatens the body if provoked. Werewolf threatens the psyche by existing, because neither one of them should exist, supposedly. But I believe they do, because they wouldn't have stories for thousands of years of the same creature. And this is where survival matters. So since we're sitting around our make-believe campfire tonight, what do you think the same question most people ask? You could look at your friend tomorrow and say, hey, what would you do? That's the most famous question. What would you do in that situation? The honest isn't heroic. Don't be a hero, right? With dogman, survival often comes from non-engagement. Do not challenge, do not chase, do not corner, do not act like you're in charge. Do not think you are the big dog on campus, right? No pun intended. Treat it like a boundary you didn't know existed until you stepped over it. I guess bow out and walk away, or hope a Bigfoot can come and save you. With werewolf, survival often comes from escape, distance, barriers, light, noise, anything that disrupts pursuit long enough to break contact. Horns, sirens, things like that. And even then, survival doesn't always feel like winning, because then you're stuck with that for the rest of your life. You know what you saw, and you can't tell anybody because they'll make fun of you. But you could tell a polar bear, because the consequences linger differently. Dogman teaches you where not to go. Werewolves teaches you that safety can be revoked without warning. And that's absolutely terrifying if you mistake one for the other. If you treat escalation like observation or observation like hesitation, you don't just misread the situation, bars, you step into it wrong. And in the dark, that's usually the last mistake anyone gets to make. So there's a point in every long night where the conversation slows down on its own. Nobody signals it, nobody announces it. Someone just stares into the fire a little longer than before, and the stories stop trying to impress anyone. That's usually when the real questions surface. Not, do you think it's real? Not, could it have been something else? Those questions burn off early. The question that stays is quieter. Why do we keep running into them? Think about that. Really think about that. Why are there so many reports of cryptid sightings on the rise. And I'm not just talking about Dogman, werewolves. I'm talking about Bigfoot, chupacabras. Cryptid sightings are on the rise. There's something going on, and I don't know what it is, but it's quite terrifying. Because here's the thing nobody likes to admit. Most witnesses swear they'll never put themselves in that position again. They start avoiding those places. They avoid the woods. They avoid back roads. They stop going out at night. They change routines, jobs, even homes. And still, the encounters continue. Not always to the same people, but to others just like them, which tells you something important. This isn't about curiosity. It's about proximity. We as a civilization are growing closer and closer to the woods. We're expanding every day, even more. Houses, subdivisions, everything's going up. So we're encroaching on these creatures' territory, and eventually they're going to have enough. That assumption is doing a lot of heavy lifting, though, okay? Dogman fits into this world like something that adapted early, something that learned our patterns the way coyotes learned highways and raccoons learned trash cans. It doesn't need to challenge us directly. It just needs to monitor overlap and correct it when necessary. That's why Dogman encounters feel instructional, right? You weren't supposed to be there. You stayed too long. You crossed something invisible. Werewolf encounters, they don't feel like that. No, they do not. They feel like rupture, like something that doesn't belong entirely to place, but to moment. A pressure spike, a flare, an event that ignites under the right conditions. Stress, isolation, darkness, vulnerability, and then the collapse again, leaving fallout behind. That's why folklore wrapped werewolves in cycles. Not because people believed in calendar magic, no, but because they noticed patterns they couldn't control. Certain nights, certain seasons, certain emotional states. And the people caught in those encounters often say the same thing later, quietly, almost ashamed. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And that might be true, which makes it worse, because it means these encounters aren't always about boundaries being crossed. Sometimes they're about boundaries failing. Sometimes Dogman teaches you that the world still has edges, and the werewolf teaches you that edges can move. That realization sits heavy on us, right? It reframes every story you've heard tonight. It explains why people don't chase answers afterwards, why they don't go public, why they hesitate to name what they saw. Naming something gives you the illusion of control, and control is the first thing both of these encounters strip away, just in different ways. Werewolf leaves you aware of how exposed you are. Dogman leaves you aware of how watched you are. And maybe that's why these stories persist across decades, cultures, landscapes, not because the creatures are identical, but because the fear they produce fits something deeply human. The fear of being noticed, the fear of being targeted, the fear of realizing that safety isn't guaranteed by familiarity. Most people listening to this will never see either one. And that's not a challenge to go look for one. And that's not a tease. It's a reminder. Okay? These encounters don't seek audiences. They happen quietly to people who thought they understood the places they moved through. People who believed the night was just an absence of light, not a different state of being. If there's a lesson here. Okay? And that word feels too clean for what it really is. It's not about the silver bullets or survival tactics or folklore trivia. It's about humility. It's about recognizing that there are still intelligent patterns and presences operating alongside us that don't need our belief to exist. They don't announce themselves. They don't explain themselves. They just intersect, briefly, violently, and memorable. And then they step back, leaving us around the fire, looking down the highway, wondering where we're going to go next. Because the truth is, none of these encounters end. They just stop happening to the person who tells them. And the wood keeps doing what they've always done. And can you guess what that is? Waiting. Well, that's it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all enjoyed it. This has been Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear. And if you've had an encounter and you want to be on the show, you can shoot me an email. The email address is polarbearhoth@gmail.com. You can reach out to me on TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, or Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. So with that being said, have a wonderful night, and remember, keep those silver bullets handy.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.